Look, I'm not saying the Galactic Council was trying to kill me when they assigned me to retrieve the Void Stalker from Kepler 442b. I'm just saying that when you send the only human on a space station full of tentacled academics to go wrangle what's essentially the universe's angriest house cat, if house cats were the size of freight trains and subsisted entirely on existential dread, well, the subtext writes itself. It's a simple extraction mission, Counselor Keth'var had explained, his 4 eyes blinking in that peculiar sequence that I'd learned meant either deep contemplation or I just passed gas. With the Zephyrians, it was honestly 50-50. The creature has been contained within the abandoned research facility on the planet's surface. All you need to do is activate the transport beacon and bring it back. Right. Simple. Like performing brain surgery with a spoon while riding a unicycle. Through a tornado, made of fire. The other council members had that look. You know the one. That barely concealed amusement that screams, we're about to watch something hilariously tragic happen to someone who isn't us. Counselor Hraktos was practically vibrating with anticipation, his chitinous shell making little clicking sounds that passed for laughter among his species. Even the normally stoic Valdris had developed what I could only describe as a smirk, though it's hard to tell when someone's face is mostly comprised of crystalline formations. Why me? I'd asked, because apparently I enjoy rhetorical questions that make me sound like the protagonist of a bad action movie. You're the most expendable, Keth'var had replied with all the tact of a freight train hitting a daycare center. I mean experienced. Yes, experienced in dealing with hostile entities. Sure I was. My experience consisted of exactly one incident where I'd accidentally walked into the wrong cargo bay and startled a Nexarian pit viper into unconsciousness. Apparently, watching me flail around screaming while a snake-like alien fainted from second-hand embarrassment, qualified as expertise in xenobiology crisis management. But here's the thing about humans that the Galactic Council hadn't quite figured out yet. We're really good at not dying when we're supposed to. It's kind of our thing. Show us certain death, and we'll find a way to not only survive it, but probably befriend it and teach it to play fetch. So naturally I said yes. The shuttle ride to Kepler 442b gave me plenty of time to contemplate my life choices. The planet looked pleasant enough from orbit, if you enjoyed the aesthetic of post-apocalyptic wasteland meets cosmic horror fever dream. The abandoned research facility squatted on the surface like a metallic tumor, all sharp angles and unnecessary spires that seemed designed by someone who'd read too many Gothic architecture manuals while high on hallucinogens. Are you certain you wish to proceed? Asked Arya, the shuttle's AI, in that tone that suggested she was already composing my obituary. Scans indicate the facility's containment systems are compromised. Compromised how? In the sense that they no longer exist. Fantastic. Nothing quite like walking into a situation where the thing designed to keep the monster locked up has given up and gone home for tea and crumpets. The facility's entrance was a charming airlock that had been torn open from the inside. Because of course it had. The metal was twisted outward in patterns that suggested whatever had done this possessed both immense strength and a flair for artistic expression. It was like someone had asked Jackson Pollock to renovate a bunker while having a psychotic episode. I checked my equipment one more time. Standard plasma rifle, which, let's be honest, was about as useful against an interdimensional predator as a water gun against a forest fire. Emergency beacon, assuming I lived long enough to use it. And a portable containment unit that looked suspiciously like a high-tech lunchbox. The council had assured me it would hold the Void Stalker. They'd probably also assured the facility's previous occupants that their containment systems were foolproof. The interior of the facility was a decorator's nightmare. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly red glow, and the walls were covered in what I really hoped was abstract art, but suspected was something significantly more organic in origin. The air had that particular quality that suggested things had died here, and those things had not died quietly. "Hello?" I called out, because apparently my survival instincts had decided to take a coffee break. "Anyone home?" Silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the facility's bowels, a sound that can only be described as what you'd get if you recorded a freight train having an argument with a blender and played it backwards through a synthesizer made of nightmares. "Okay," I muttered. "That's definitely not the welcome wagon." The facility's layout was a maze of corridors that seemed to have been designed by someone who'd failed basic geometry but passed advanced sadism with flying colors. Every turn led to another identical hallway, each one slightly more ominous than the last. It was like being trapped in a bureaucratic fever dream, except the filing cabinets were trying to kill you. I found the first body about 20 minutes in. Or rather, I found what was left of it. The Zephyrian researcher had been rearranged. That's probably the most diplomatic way to put it. It looked like someone had tried to solve a jigsaw puzzle but had used a blender instead of patience. The walls around the remains were decorated with claw marks that spelled out what I could only assume was either an alien curse word or a grocery list written by someone with serious anger management issues. Note to self, I said to my recorder. Ask HR about hazard pay when I get back. Assuming I get back. Assuming there's still an HR department. Assuming there's still a station. The deeper I went, the more creative the carnage became. It was like touring a museum dedicated to the artistic applications of extreme violence. The Void Stalker, whatever it was, had apparently approached murder the way Michelangelo had approached the Sistine Chapel, with passion, dedication, and a complete disregard for anyone else's opinion on the matter. I found the main laboratory eventually, though found might be too generous a term for what was essentially stumbling into it while trying to avoid what looked like a chandelier made of rib cages. The lab was enormous, filled with equipment that I couldn't identify but which looked expensive and thoroughly broken. In the center of the room sat a containment chamber that had been opened from the inside with all the subtlety of a controlled demolition. And next to it, taking what appeared to be a nap, was the Void Stalker. Now, I'd seen a lot of alien creatures during my time on the station. I'd met beings that looked like walking crystals, others that resembled sentient gas clouds, and one memorable individual who was essentially a hive mind of microscopic robots that had decided to cosplay as a humanoid. But the Void Stalker was something else entirely. Imagine, if you will, what would happen if H.P. Lovecraft in a fever dream had a baby, and that baby grew up to become a professional wrestler. The creature was massive, easily 12 feet long and built like a tank that had been designed by someone who'd never seen a tank but had heard them described by someone who was colorblind and possibly insane. Its hide was a shifting pattern of colors that my eyes refused to process properly, creating an optical illusion that made my brain feel like it was trying to solve a Rubik's Cube made of geometry that shouldn't exist. It had too many limbs, at least 8 that I could count, though the number seemed to change depending on the angle I viewed it from. Each limb ended in what could charitably be called hands, if hands were made of crystalline claws and existential uncertainty. Its head was a nightmare of angles and teeth, with eyes that looked like they'd been stolen from the universe's personal collection of things that shouldn't be. And it was purring. I wish I was making that up. The interdimensional horror that had turned an entire research facility into its personal art project was lying there making a sound like a diesel engine that had achieved enlightenment. Well, I said quietly, this is unexpected. The Void Stalker's eyes opened, all 6 of them, arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. They focused on me with the kind of attention usually reserved for interesting insects or particularly complex mathematical theorems. I waited for the inevitable charge, the roar of fury, the artistic rearrangement of my internal organs. Instead, it tilted its head like a curious dog. I said, which is universally recognized as the sound humans make when their brain has temporarily disconnected from their mouth. Good. Monster? The Void Stalker made a sound that I can only describe as a questioning chirp. If question marks could be weaponized and deployed through vocal cords that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, this is what they would sound like. I took a careful step forward. The creature watched me with the same intensity that art critics bring to gallery openings, as if it was trying to determine whether I represented a significant contribution to the field of things that exist, or just another derivative work in the tired genre of carbon-based life forms. Look, I said, because talking to eldritch horrors is apparently what passes for reasonable behavior in my life now. I'm supposed to take you back to the station. Not sure how you feel about that, but I'm hoping we can work something out that doesn't involve me becoming wall decoration. The Void Stalker's response was to stand up, which was a process that involved more joints bending in more directions than I'd previously thought possible. It towered over me, a living contradiction of physics and good taste, and I prepared myself for what was probably going to be a very brief and very colorful ending to my career in xenobiology. Instead, it walked over to the containment unit I'd brought and climbed inside. Just like that. No fuss, no muss, no artistic interpretation of my digestive system. It folded itself into the container with the fluid grace of someone who'd done this before, made itself comfortable, and looked at me expectantly. Seriously? I asked. It chirped again, a sound that somehow conveyed both affirmation and mild impatience. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for the other shoe to drop, or the other claw to descend, or the other dimension to implode. When none of those things happened, I carefully closed the containment unit and activated the stasis field. The Void Stalker settled into hibernation with what I swear was a contented sigh. The trip back to the station was remarkably uneventful, if you don't count my constant paranoia that the containment unit was going to explode and release a cosmic horror into the shuttle's recycled air supply. But the Void Stalker remained peacefully dormant, occasionally making soft rumbling sounds that suggested it was having pleasant dreams about whatever interdimensional predators dream about. Probably geometry, or the sound of screaming, or geometrically screaming shapes. Arya kept running diagnostics on the containment unit every 30 seconds, as if she expected it to suddenly announce that it had been compromised by the power of friendship or something equally improbable. Containment integrity remains at 100%, she reported for the dozenth time. I must admit, this outcome was not among my projected scenarios. What were your projected scenarios? Death. Various forms of death. Several forms of death that don't technically qualify as death but are close enough for practical purposes. That's reassuring. I try to be helpful. The station appeared on our screens looking exactly as I'd left it, a sprawling collection of interconnected modules that resembled what you'd get if someone had asked a committee of architects to design a city, while they were all having simultaneous nervous breakdowns. It wasn't pretty, but it was home, and more importantly, it was home with medical facilities and psychological counselors who specialized in cosmic horror-related trauma. The docking procedure went smoothly, which should have been my first clue that the universe was setting me up for something. In my experience, whenever things go smoothly, it's because reality is saving up all the chaos for one spectacular moment of maximum inconvenience. The council was waiting for me in the main docking bay, which was unusual. Normally, they preferred to maintain their air of mysterious authority by making me trek across half the station to report to them. Seeing them all clustered around the shuttle like expectant parents at a science fair suggested they were either very excited or very nervous. Possibly both. "Human Collins," Vex Thack greeted me as I descended the shuttle ramp. His 4 eyes blinking in what I'd learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of barely contained anxiety. "We trust your mission was successful?" "Define successful," I replied, because I'm apparently allergic to straightforward answers. The other council members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their collective confidence in my survival skills. Fraktos was making that chittering sound again, though this time it seemed less amused and more nervous. Valdris had assumed what I'd learned was her species' equivalent of a defensive posture, which involved rearranging her crystalline formations into patterns that suggested either deep thought or preparation for violence. "The Void Stalker," pressed Counselor Yithran, the only member of the group who could be charitably described as humanoid, if humans were made of liquid metal and had a disturbing tendency to shift between states of matter without warning. "You were able to contain it?" "Oh, I contained it all right," I said, patting the containment unit. Though I'm not sure contain is the right word. Befriend might be more accurate. The silence that followed this statement was the kind of silence that usually precedes either award ceremonies or court-martial proceedings. Given my track record, I was betting on the latter. Befriend? Vexthak's voice had climbed several octaves, which in Zephyrian vocal physiology meant he was either terrified or preparing to molt. "You befriended an interdimensional predator?" Well, befriend might be overstating it. Let's call it a mutual understanding. I agreed not to shoot it with my plasma rifle, and it agreed not to redecorate the facility with my internal organs. It's a solid foundation for any relationship. Fraktos had stopped chittering entirely, which was never a good sign. When a Keth'vari goes silent, it usually means they're either processing something extremely complex or preparing to run away very quickly. Sometimes both. "The creature," Valdris said in her voice that sounded like wind chimes having an existential crisis. "It came willingly? Enthusiastically even. Climbed right into the containment unit like it was checking into a 5-star hotel. I think it might have been lonely." "Lonely," repeated Yithran, their metallic form rippling in patterns that suggested either deep contemplation or the early stages of a panic attack. The apex predator that has been terrorizing the outer colonies for the past 6 months was lonely. It's possible. I mean, think about it from its perspective. You're an interdimensional horror with a gift for interior design, and everywhere you go, people either run away screaming or try to shoot you. That's gotta be tough on the social life. The council members looked at each other with the kind of expressions that suggested they were reconsidering their life choices, or at least their choice to send me on this mission. "Perhaps," Vexthak said carefully, "we should examine the creature before drawing any conclusions about its emotional state." "Sure thing. Just keep in mind that it's been very cooperative so far, and I'd hate to see that change because someone decided to poke it with something sharp." The examination room in the station's xenobiology department had been hastily reinforced with enough shielding to stop a small asteroid. Or a large asteroid. Or possibly a moon that had developed anger management issues. The council had spared no expense in ensuring that if the Void Stalker decided to resume its career in creative violence, it would have to work for it. Dr. Keth'var, the station's chief xenobiologist, was practically vibrating with excitement as we wheeled the containment unit into the room. Keth'var belonged to a species that looked like someone had crossed an octopus with a filing cabinet, and given the result a doctorate in theoretical biology. They were brilliant, dedicated, and had absolutely no sense of self-preservation when it came to studying dangerous life forms. Magnificent, Keth'var breathed, their tentacles dancing in patterns that I'd learned indicated extreme academic arousal. Simply magnificent. The readings are off the charts. What readings? I asked, because in my experience, when scientists start getting excited about readings, it usually means something is about to explode. Psionic emanations, dimensional fluctuations, bioelectric fields. This creature exists on at least 7 different planes of reality simultaneously. It's like someone took the concept of predator and gave it graduate degrees in physics and philosophy. The containment unit was humming softly, a sound that suggested its occupant was still peacefully dormant, or possibly planning something elaborate and probably fatal. With cosmic horrors, it was hard to tell the difference. The question is, Vexthak said, how do we study it without becoming its next art project? Very carefully, I suggested. And maybe with snacks. I get the feeling it might be food-motivated. Food-motivated, Kraktos repeated, his chittering returning in a pattern that suggested either disbelief or the early stages of hysteria. You believe the Void Stalker can be managed with snacks. Hey, it worked with my neighbor's dog back on Earth. Meanest-looking pit bull you ever saw. But give it a biscuit and it turned into a 40-pound lapdog with attachment issues. The silence that followed this comparison was broken by Dr. Keth'var's excited tentacle waving. Actually, they said, that's not entirely unreasonable. Many apex predators exhibit food-motivated behavioral patterns. If the creature has been isolated for extended periods, it might respond positively to regular feeding schedules and social interaction. Social interaction, Valdris said in a tone that suggested she was contemplating the heat death of the universe and finding it preferable to our current situation, with an interdimensional horror. Think of it as extreme xenobiology fieldwork, I suggested. Very extreme. Possibly fatally extreme. The deactivation of the stasis field was done with all the ceremony and preparation usually reserved for disarming nuclear weapons or performing surgery on royalty. The entire xenobiology department had been evacuated except for the essential personnel, who had drawn straws to determine who got to stay and who got to run away to a safe distance. I hadn't drawn a straw. I'd volunteered. Apparently my definition of reasonable life choices had become somewhat flexible. The Void Stalker stirred as the stasis field faded, its impossible geometry shifting in ways that made my eyes water and my brain file a formal complaint with my central nervous system. It stretched, a process that involved more joints than I'd thought possible, and created sounds like someone tuning an orchestra made of suffering. And then focused its 6 eyes on me with the intensity of a laser beam made of curiosity. Hey there, I said, because greeting cosmic horrors with casual familiarity is apparently my brand now. Sleep well? The creature chirped, that same questioning sound I'd heard in the laboratory. It looked around the examination room with what I could only interpret as interest, taking in the reinforced walls, the monitoring equipment, and the small crowd of scientists who were trying very hard to look official while hiding behind blast shields. Welcome to Station Kepler 7, I continued, because apparently I'd decided to give it the full tour guide experience. Population, roughly 3,000 beings from 47 different species, all of whom are probably hoping you don't decide to redecorate their living quarters. The Void Stalker tilted its head in that curious dog gesture, then did something I hadn't expected. It spoke. Not in any language I recognized, mind you. The sounds it made were like someone trying to communicate using a vocabulary composed entirely of concepts that shouldn't exist. But there was definitely intention behind it. A clear attempt at communication that made everyone in the room simultaneously lean forward with interest and step back in terror. Did anyone else hear that? Dr. Keth'var whispered, their tentacles forming patterns that indicated extreme excitement mixed with the early stages of nervous breakdown. It's trying to communicate. Of course it's trying to communicate, I said. It's intelligent. Probably more intelligent than all of us put together. Question is, can we figure out what it's trying to say? The creature made another series of sounds, this time accompanied by gestures with several of its limbs. The movements were precise, deliberate, and reminded me of nothing so much as someone trying to explain a complex concept to a particularly slow student. It's... Valdris paused, her crystalline form flickering through several color patterns that I'd learned indicated deep thought. It's trying to tell us something about itself. What makes you say that? The gestural patterns. They're self-referential. It's pointing to itself while making those sounds. I looked at the Void Stalker, who was indeed gesturing at itself while making noises that sounded like the universe's most complicated knock-knock joke. It caught me watching and made a new sound, one that somehow conveyed both frustration and patience in equal measure. I think, I said slowly, it's trying to tell us its name. The creature's 6 eyes lit up. Literally. They began glowing with a soft bioluminescence that made the room look like a very disturbing nightlight. It repeated the sequence of sounds and gestures, more emphatically this time. Its name, repeated Vexathak, his 4 eyes blinking in the rapid pattern that indicated either deep thought or an impending anxiety attack. The interdimensional predator has a name. Well, yeah, most intelligent beings do. What did you think, that it just went around thinking of itself as the scary thing that eats people? The Void Stalker made another sound, this one distinctly different from the name sounds. It was deeper, more resonant, and carried undertones that made my teeth itch and my spleen contemplate filing for early retirement. What was that one? Dr. Keth'var asked, their scientific curiosity overriding their survival instincts in a way that was either admirable or deeply concerning. The creature repeated the sound, then gestured toward the exit. The meaning was clear even across species barriers and dimensional differences. I think, I said, it wants to go for a walk. Walking an interdimensional predator through a space station is not covered in any manual I'm aware of. Starfleet Academy probably has a course on it, but since Starfleet Academy is fictional and I'm not, I had to improvise. The compromise we worked out was essentially a guided tour with heavy security presence. The Void Stalker, who had somehow communicated that its name was something like Whisper of Stars Between Thoughts, which was both beautiful and impossible to pronounce without dislocating your larynx, walked between me and a small army of security personnel who looked like they were expecting to die heroically at any moment. Whisper, as I'd decided to call it for the sake of my vocal cords, seemed genuinely interested in everything it saw. It examined the station's architecture with the eye of a professional, occasionally making sounds that I chose to interpret as artistic critique rather than threat assessment. When we passed other beings in the corridors, it would pause and study them with the kind of intense curiosity usually reserved for museum exhibits or particularly complex puzzles. Most of the station's inhabitants had been strongly encouraged to remain in their quarters during our little field trip, but a few had either missed the memo or decided that getting a first-hand look at an interdimensional horror was worth the risk of becoming an interdimensional snack. These brave or foolish souls would stop and stare as we passed, and Whisper would politely stop and stare back, creating little tableaux that probably violated several principles of cosmic horror etiquette. It's remarkably well behaved, observed Commander Rex Thull, the station's head of security, who was following our procession with the grim determination of someone expecting to write a lot of casualty reports. I was expecting more carnage. Maybe it's just happy to have company, I suggested. How long was it trapped in that facility? According to the records, approximately 6 months. The research team went silent after they began experimenting with dimensional barriers. 6 months of solitary confinement would make anyone a little testy. No wonder it redecorated the place. Whisper had stopped in front of one of the station's viewing ports, pressing what I assumed was its face against the transparent aluminum to stare out at the stars. It made a series of soft sounds that somehow conveyed both longing and melancholy, as if it was looking at something infinitely far away. Homesick, I said quietly. What? Rexithal's antennae twitched in the way that indicated either confusion or the early stages of molt preparation. It's homesick. Look at it. We all looked at Whisper, who continued to gaze out at the cosmos with the expression of someone who'd lost their keys in a universe that was approximately 14 billion years wide. It was a surprisingly humanizing moment, watching an eldritch horror experience what was unmistakably a case of cosmic homesickness. Where do you think it's from? Dr. Keth'var asked, their tentacles writhing in patterns that indicated scientific curiosity mixed with something that might have been sympathy. Somewhere else, I said. Somewhere very, very else. The breakthrough came 3 days later, during what had become our regular afternoon constitutional around the station's upper ring. Whisper had developed what could only be described as favorite spots. The observation deck with the best view of the local nebula, the botanical gardens where it seemed fascinated by the variety of plant life, and somewhat inexplicably, the station's primary computer core, where it would sit and listen to the humming of the processors with what appeared to be contentment. I'd been trying to teach it basic galactic standard, with limited success. Whisper was clearly intelligent enough to understand the concept of language, but its vocal apparatus wasn't designed for anything resembling conventional communication. The sounds it made existed in frequency ranges that weren't supposed to exist, and conveyed meanings that couldn't be translated into any language that operated within normal space-time. But it was trying, and more importantly, it was learning. "Station," I said, pointing at the walls around us. "Station." Whisper repeated the word, or at least made a sound that bore a vague resemblance to it if you filtered it through a translator that had been hit by lightning and developed philosophical doubts about the nature of meaning. "Good," I said, and Whisper's eyes brightened in that way that indicated pleasure. "Now what about—" I paused, trying to think of something simple. Friend. Whisper tilted its head, processing this new concept. Then it made a sound that was clearly meant to be friend, though it came out sounding like the word had been put through a blender and then reconstructed by someone who'd only heard it described secondhand. "Friend," it repeated, and then did something that made my heart skip approximately 17 beats. It pointed at me. "Friend," it said again, more clearly this time, and there was no mistaking the meaning. "Yeah," I said, and I'll admit my voice was a little thick. "Friend." That's when Dr. Keth'var came running into the observation deck with the kind of excitement that usually preceded either major scientific breakthroughs or catastrophic equipment failures. "Collins!" they shouted, their tentacles writhing in patterns that indicated either extreme joy or the early stages of a nervous breakdown. "Collins, you need to see this." "What's wrong?" I asked. Because in my experience, when scientists get excited, someone's usually about to die in an interesting way.
"Nothing's wrong!"
"Everything's right. Everything's so right, it's practically singing opera." Whisper made an interested chirping sound and followed as Dr. Keth'var led us to their laboratory. The room was filled with displays showing readouts that meant nothing to me, but apparently meant everything to someone with a doctorate in xenobiology and a subscription to Interdimensional Horror Quarterly. "The creature's bioelectric patterns," Keth'var explained, gesturing wildly at the screens. "They've been changing, evolving, and not randomly. There's a clear progression, a deliberate adaptation." "Adaptation to what?"
"To us, to the station, to three-dimensional space."
Keth'var's excitement was reaching levels that probably violated several health and safety regulations. "It's learning to exist in our reality." I looked at Whisper, who was examining the readouts with the air of someone reviewing their own medical chart. It made a series of sounds that somehow conveyed both satisfaction and mild embarrassment. "You're changing yourself," I said to it. "Adapting, so you can stay here." Whisper nodded, an unmistakably human gesture that it had picked up from watching me. Then it made a sound that was definitely friend, and definitely directed at me. "But why?" I asked. "Why adapt? Why not just go home?" Whisper's response was a series of sounds and gestures that took several minutes to complete. When it was finished, Dr. Keth'var was staring at their readouts with an expression of dawning comprehension. "It can't," they said quietly. "It can't go home." "What do you mean?" "The dimensional barriers. The research facility was experimenting with ways to block interdimensional travel. They succeeded. The barriers they created didn't just trap the creature in our dimension. They severed its connection to its home reality. It's stuck here." I looked at Whisper, who was gazing out the laboratory's viewing port with that same expression of cosmic longing I'd seen before. Suddenly, the weeks of cooperation, the willingness to be contained, the genuine attempts at communication, it all made sense. "You're not a predator," I said. "You're a refugee." Whisper turned to look at me, and for the first time, I could read the expression in its impossible eyes. It was relief, the relief of finally being understood. "Friend," it said, and this time the word was clear, unfiltered by dimensional static or cosmic translation errors. "Yeah," I said. "Friend." The emergency session of the Galactic Council that followed this revelation was, in the words of Counselor Vex Thak, a complete clusterfuck of interdimensional proportions. This was unusually colorful language for a Zephyrian, but then again, discovering that they'd spent 6 months trying to study what was essentially a cosmic refugee while treating it like a dangerous predator had left everyone a little rattled. "So let me understand this correctly," Valdris said, her crystalline form flickering through color patterns that indicated deep confusion mixed with the early stages of an existential crisis. "The creature that we believed was terrorizing the outer colonies was actually trying to communicate," I finished. "The attacks were attempts at first contact. The artistic rearrangement of the research facility was probably its way of expressing frustration at being imprisoned. And the deaths? Accidents. When you're a multidimensional being trying to shake hands with three-dimensional people, things are going to get messy. Literally. Raktos had stopped chittering entirely, which was never a good sign. When he finally spoke, his voice had the quality of someone who'd just realized they'd been doing their job completely wrong for the past several months. "We sent you to capture a monster," he said slowly. "And you came back with a person. A person who happens to be made of nightmare geometry and existential uncertainty, but yeah. Essentially." Yithran's metallic form rippled through several configurations that suggested they were processing information that didn't quite fit into their understanding of how the universe was supposed to work. "What do we do now?" they asked. It was a good question. The Galactic Council had protocols for dealing with hostile alien lifeforms, dangerous artifacts, and the occasional interdimensional invasion. They did not have protocols for what to do when the interdimensional horror turned out to be basically a lost tourist with anger management issues. "We help it," I said. "We find it a place to live, help it adapt to our reality, maybe see if we can figure out a way to communicate with others of its species. Turn a potential first contact disaster into an actual first contact success. And if it decides it doesn't like our reality," Vexthak asked, "if it becomes homesick enough to take out its frustrations on the local population?" I thought about Whisper, sitting in the observation deck and watching the stars with that expression of quiet longing. About the way it had learned to say friend and meant it. About how it had voluntarily climbed into a containment unit because it understood that cooperation was better than conflict. "It won't," I said. "Trust me on this one." "Trust you," repeated Hraktos, and his chittering returned in a pattern that suggested either amusement or the early stages of hysteria. "The human who was supposed to die horribly is asking us to trust him about the interdimensional refugee he's befriended. When you put it like that, it sounds crazy. It sounds completely insane. Yeah, but it's the good kind of insane, the kind that works out in everyone's favor." The council members looked at each other with expressions that suggested they were reconsidering their career choices. "Again." "Very well," Vexthak said finally. "We'll try it your way. But if the creature starts redecorating the station with our internal organs, I'm holding you personally responsible." "Fair enough," I said. "But I don't think you'll have to worry about that." 6 months later, Whisper of Stars Between Thoughts had become something of a celebrity on station Kepler 7. Not because it was an interdimensional horror, though that certainly added to its mystique, but because it had turned out to be remarkably good at solving complex engineering problems. When you exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously, apparently, three-dimensional technical difficulties become laughably simple. The station's chronic power distribution issues? Fixed in an afternoon. The mysterious malfunction in the waste recycling system that had been baffling our best engineers for months? Solved with what could only be described as a cosmic shrug and some rearranging of components that shouldn't have worked but absolutely did. It's like having a technical consultant who operates on principles of physics that don't officially exist. Chief Engineer Brachtul had explained to me over drinks at the station's only bar. Half the solutions it suggests violate the laws of thermodynamics, but they work perfectly. Maybe the laws of thermodynamics are more like guidelines when you're dealing with beings from other dimensions, I had suggested. "That's a terrifying thought," Brachtul had replied, then ordered another drink. Whisper had also developed something resembling a social life, which was possibly the strangest sentence I'd ever had to think. It had a regular table at the cafeteria where it would sit and observe the other beings eating, occasionally making sounds that I'd learned to interpret as commentary on the food. It couldn't eat station rations. Something about its metabolism operating on principles that our reality found philosophically objectionable. But it seemed to enjoy the social aspect of mealtimes. It had also become friends with Lieutenant Zaraketh, a young Nexarian who worked in communications and had the kind of fearless curiosity that was either admirable or deeply concerning, depending on your perspective. She'd been the first being other than myself to approach Whisper voluntarily, and now they spent hours together in what could only be described as language exchange sessions. "It's teaching me to perceive sounds that exist in 7 dimensions, she'd explained to me one day, her scaled features bright with excitement. "And I'm teaching it colloquial Nexarian curse words. It's surprisingly good at them." "Of course it is," I'd muttered, because apparently my cosmic horror refugee had developed a talent for profanity in multiple dimensions. But the real breakthrough had come 3 weeks ago, when Whisper had started working with Dr. Keshan on what they called Project Lighthouse. The idea was ambitious in the way that only seemed reasonable when you had an interdimensional being helping with the technical details. Using Whisper's unique ability to perceive multiple dimensional layers simultaneously, they were attempting to create a communication array that could send messages across dimensional barriers. "If we can establish contact with Whisper's home dimension, Dr. Keshan had explained during one of their breathless technical briefings, We might be able to facilitate communication between our realities, exchange information, establish diplomatic relations, maybe even figure out how to repair the dimensional barriers that were damaged in the original research accident. And if Whisper's people turn out to be less friendly than Whisper? I'd asked. Then we'll have advance warning of an interdimensional invasion, Keth'var had replied cheerfully. Either way, it's valuable data. I'd decided not to think too hard about the implications of that statement. The day the array came online was marked by what could only be described as controlled chaos. Half the station's population had gathered in the main observation deck to watch the first test, while the other half had prudently evacuated to the far end of the station in case something went horribly wrong. Whisper stood next to the newly constructed array, its impossible geometry somehow managing to look nervous. Over the months, I'd gotten better at reading its body language, and right now every angle of its being screamed, "First day of school anxiety." "You ready for this?" I asked. Whisper made a sound that was half affirmation, half terror, and entirely relatable. Then it placed several of its limbs on the array's interface nodes, and began the process of establishing contact with its home dimension. The array hummed to life, emitting sounds that existed in frequency ranges that made my teeth ache and my philosophical convictions question themselves. Reality seemed to shimmer around the device, as if the universe was having second thoughts about the whole concept of dimensional stability. Then, from speakers that shouldn't have been able to reproduce sounds that didn't technically exist, came a voice. It spoke in the same impossible language that Whisper used. All concepts and emotions rendered in auditory frequencies that human ears weren't designed to process. But even filtered through universal translators and dimensional static, the meaning was clear. Relief. Joy. The cosmic equivalent of someone answering a phone call they'd been waiting months to receive. Whisper's response was immediate and overwhelming. It made sounds I'd never heard before, a complex symphony of joy and sadness and hope that seemed to fill the entire observation deck. Several beings in the crowd were openly weeping, though whether from emotion or dimensional interference was unclear. The conversation that followed lasted for nearly an hour, though conversation might not be the right word for an exchange of information that operated on principles of communication that existed outside normal spacetime. Dr. Keth'var frantically took notes while their instruments recorded data that would probably revolutionize xenolinguistics and possibly break several graduate students' brains. When it was over, Whisper turned to face the gathered crowd. Its 6 eyes were glowing with that soft bioluminescence that indicated contentment. And when it spoke, its words were clear enough that the universal translators could handle them without difficulty. "Home," it said, and the word carried undertones of completion and satisfaction. "Home knows. Home understands. Home forgives." The silence that followed was broken by someone in the crowd. I think it was Lieutenant Zaraketh, starting to applaud. The sound spread through the observation deck, building into a cacophony of approval from dozens of different species, each expressing celebration in their own unique way. Whisper looked around at the crowd, then at me, and made a sound that needed no translation. "Gratitude." "So," I said to Whisper later that evening, as we sat in our usual spot on the observation deck, watching the stars, "what happens now?" Whisper had been unusually quiet since the successful contact with its home dimension. Not sad, exactly, but contemplative in the way that beings get when they're processing major life changes. "Home wants me to return," it said, the words coming more easily now after months of practice. "Says the barriers can be repaired. Fixed. I can go back." "That's great news," I said and meant it. "You must be excited." Whisper made a sound that somehow conveyed both excitement and uncertainty. "Excited, yes, but also conflicted." "Conflicted how?" It gestured around the observation deck, taking in the view of the station, the stars, the small corner of three-dimensional reality that had become its temporary home. "Here is different," it said slowly, working through concepts that didn't translate easily. "Here is smaller, simpler, but also warmer." I looked at my interdimensional friend, trying to understand what it was trying to tell me. "You like it here," I said. "I like friends," Whisper replied. "I like being helpful. In home dimension I am small. Unimportant. Here I am, unique. Valued. You're thinking about staying." It was a statement, not a question, and Whisper's silence was answer enough. "What did your people say when you told them that?" "They were surprised, confused. Home dimension does not understand concept of choosing to be different." I thought about that for a moment, about what it meant for a being from a reality where individuality was apparently not the norm to discover that it liked being unique. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Whisper was quiet for a long time, staring out at the nebula that had become its favorite view. When it finally spoke, Its voice carried a certainty that hadn't been there before. I want to stay, it said, but I also want to help. Home Dimension has others like me. Others who are curious about different realities. Maybe they would like to visit, to learn, to be ambassadors. You want to establish a permanent exchange program. Yes, I think both realities could benefit from knowing each other. But carefully, safely, with proper protocols. I grinned, imagining the look on the Galactic Council's faces when I presented them with a proposal for interdimensional cultural exchange programs. You know, I said, I think the Council is going to love this idea, especially after I explain how much they could charge for interdimensional tourism. Whisper made a sound that I'd learned was its version of laughter, a soft, harmonious tone that seemed to make the air itself happy. Friend Collins, it said, you understand beings very well. I understand that beings everywhere, no matter what dimension they're from, like new experiences and the opportunity to feel superior to tourists from other realities. This is wisdom. This is cynicism. But in this case, cynicism that works in our favor. The final Galactic Council meeting I attended on this particular adventure was significantly different from the one where they'd essentially sent me off to die with a plasma rifle and a lunchbox. For one thing, nobody was trying to hide their amusement at my probable demise. For another, they were all taking notes. Let me see if I understand this correctly, Vexthak said, his 4 eyes blinking in patterns that indicated either deep thought or the early stages of a migraine. The creature, Whisper, I corrected. Whisper wants to establish a formal diplomatic relationship between our reality and its home dimension, with itself serving as the primary cultural liaison. That's the basic idea, yeah. And it believes that others of its species would be interested in visiting our reality as part of a cultural exchange program. Supervised visits, I clarified. With proper orientation and safety protocols, nobody wants a repeat of the research facility incident. Hraktos was chittering in what I'd learned was his species' equivalent of nervous laughter. Cultural exchange with interdimensional beings. Interdimensional tourism. This is either the most brilliant diplomatic initiative in galactic history, or the most elaborate suicide pact ever conceived. Why not both? I suggested cheerfully. Valdris had been unusually quiet during the briefing, her crystalline form cycling through color patterns that indicated deep consideration. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd made a significant decision. The potential benefits are extraordinary, she said. Access to technologies and perspectives from a completely different reality. Opportunities for scientific advancement that we can barely imagine. Expansion of our understanding of the fundamental nature of existence itself. And the potential risks? Ytheron asked, their metallic form rippling through configurations that suggested they already knew the answer. Catastrophic reality failure, dimensional collapse, the possible end of existence as we know it. Valdris replied matter-of-factly. You know, the usual risks associated with first contact scenarios. When you put it like that, I said, it sounds almost reasonable. The council members exchanged looks that suggested they were all reconsidering their career choices. Again, it was becoming a theme. Very well, Vexthak said finally. We'll approve a limited trial program. 1 additional visitor from Whisper's dimension. Supervised contact only. Full monitoring and safety protocols. And if it goes well, then we'll consider expanding the program. Gradually. Very gradually. Possibly over the course of several centuries. That seems reasonable, I said. Though privately I suspected that once word got out about our interdimensional cultural exchange program, we'd have beings lining up from 17 different realities to participate. The universe, it seemed, was full of creatures who were curious about their neighbors, even when their neighbors existed in completely different dimensions and occasionally violated the laws of physics as a hobby. The arrival of the second interdimensional visitor was marked by significantly less panic than Whisper's original appearance, though this was partly because we now had proper procedures for welcoming cosmic horrors to our reality, a practical guide. Dr. Keshan had written the manual personally, and it was surprisingly thorough for something that covered a topic that shouldn't technically exist. The new visitor, who introduced itself with a sound that roughly translated to harmony of singing voids, but who we called Echo for practical purposes, was notably different from Whisper. Where Whisper was all angles and crystalline claws, Echo was more fluid, shifting between states of matter with the casual ease of someone changing clothes. It also seemed to have a better grasp of our dimensional physics from the start, possibly because Whisper had spent the past few weeks briefing it on the basics of how to exist in 3 dimensions without accidentally destroying everything. The integration process went smoother than anyone had dared hope. Echo was curious about everything, eager to learn, and had an almost childlike enthusiasm for concepts like linear time and objects that stay the same shape. It also turned out to have a talent for what could only be described as interdimensional interior design, which led to it volunteering to help renovate some of the station's more problematic architectural features. It's like having a contractor who operates on principles of geometry that don't officially exist, Chief Engineer Bracktool had explained to me, sounding significantly less stressed than he had during Echo's first week on the station. Half the renovations it suggests shouldn't be structurally sound, but they're actually improvements. Maybe structural soundness is more flexible when you're dealing with beings who understand the underlying mathematics of reality, I'd suggested. That's still a terrifying thought, Bracktool had replied, but this time he'd sounded more intrigued than horrified. The real success of the program, though, was measured in smaller moments. Echo and Whisper sitting together in the cafeteria, making sounds that might have been gossip about interdimensional politics, or might have been philosophical discussions about the nature of existence. Lieutenant Zara Keth teaching both of them card games that had to be modified to account for players who existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Dr. Keshan frantically taking notes as the two visitors discussed concepts that were revolutionizing our understanding of theoretical physics and practical engineering in equal measure. Most importantly, both visitors seemed genuinely happy to be there. They'd found something in our three-dimensional reality that their home dimension couldn't provide. The opportunity to be individuals, to make choices, to form friendships based on personal connection rather than dimensional compatibility. It was, I realized, the same thing that had drawn humans to the stars in the first place. The desire to explore, to discover, to find new ways of being in a universe that was vast and strange and full of possibilities. So, I said to Whisper one evening, as we sat in our usual spot watching the nebula shift through colors that probably violated several artistic conventions. Any regrets about staying? Whisper made a sound that conveyed contentment and certainty in equal measure. No regrets, it said. This reality is good, different but good. Even with all the limitations, the linear time, the three-dimensional space, the physics that actually make sense? Especially because of limitations, Whisper replied. Limitations create possibilities. In home dimension, everything that can exist does exist. Here, things must be chosen, created, decided. This makes them more precious. I thought about that, about what it meant for a being from a reality of infinite possibilities to find value in a universe of constraints and limitations. Plus, Whisper added, and I could hear the amusement in its voice, linear time means experiences can be savored. In home dimension, all moments exist simultaneously. Here, each moment is unique, special. You're getting philosophical on me. Friend Collins taught me philosophy. Said it was important for understanding different perspectives. I never taught you philosophy. You taught me friendship. Same thing. I looked at my interdimensional friend, at the being who had started as an assignment that was supposed to kill me, and had ended up changing everything I thought I knew about the universe and our place in it. Yeah, I said. I guess it is. Above us, the nebula continued its slow dance through colors that had no names in any language I knew. But somehow, sitting there with Whisper, watching the stars and contemplating the nature of friendship across dimensional boundaries, they seemed like exactly the right colors for the moment. In the distance, I could see the lights of the station, home to 3,000 beings from 47 different species and 2 different dimensions, all somehow managing to coexist in a corner of space that had become a little bit stranger and a lot more interesting since the day the Galactic Council had decided to send me to certain death. I'd come back with a monster on a leash, just like the mission briefing had probably intended. The only difference was that the monster had turned out to be a friend, the leash had turned out to be mutual respect, and certain death had turned out to be the beginning of something extraordinary. Not bad for a day's work, even by human standards. The end. So there I was, minding my own business in the most boring corner of the galaxy, when I accidentally discovered that humans are absolutely, certifiably insane. And I mean that in the most terrifying way possible. My name is Keth'var. Yeah, I know. Sounds like someone clearing their throat. But that's what you get when your species evolved from crystalline cave dwellers who communicated through harmonic resonance. I'm what you might call a xenobiologist, though that's putting it generously. Really, I'm more like a cosmic tourist with a PhD, wandering around the galaxy, cataloging weird alien behaviors and trying not to get eaten. The Galactic Scientific Consortium pays me decent credits to document emerging sentient species behavioral patterns, which is academic speak for go poke strange aliens with a stick and see what happens. It's not glamorous work, but it beats my previous job as a mineral taste tester on the sulfur mines of Bracton 7. Humans, according to my briefing files, were supposed to be a nice, safe assignment. Recently contacted species, technologically primitive, probably spend most of their time hitting things with rocks and making crude art on cave walls. The kind of civilization you could study from orbit while sipping fermented algae extract and working on your dissertation about the philosophical implications of tool use among carbon-based bipeds. Boy, was I wrong. The first sign that something was deeply, fundamentally off about these creatures came when I tried to make contact. Standard procedure. Land your observation pod in a remote area. Deploy universal translators. Approach the nearest settlement with hands visible and empty, and announce peaceful intentions while broadcasting mathematical proofs to demonstrate intelligence. I followed the protocol to the letter. Found a nice isolated spot near what appeared to be a small human settlement, maybe 30 structures, primitive but organized. The buildings were constructed from processed organic matter and mineral composites, which suggested they'd at least figured out basic engineering. Promising. I activated my environmental suit. Humans breathe a fairly standard oxygen-nitrogen mix, but you can never be too careful. And began my approach just after local sunrise. The universal translator hummed to life, analyzing ambient electromagnetic communications and building a linguistic database. That's when I heard it.
Contact, contact, contact!
Unknown entity approaching from the southeast, approximately 200 meters out. Repeat, we have an unknown entity. I froze. The voice was coming through my translator, which meant the humans were using some form of organized communication system. But the tone was all wrong. Where I expected curiosity or fear, I heard something that made my crystalline structure vibrate with unease. Professional competence.
Roger that, base.
Visual confirmation on the entity. Bipedal, roughly humanoid, wearing what appears to be environmental gear. Preliminary assessment. Potential first contact scenario. First contact scenario? These creatures had protocols for first contact? Suddenly my nice, safe assignment was looking significantly less safe. Copy. All units maintain distance but keep visual contact. Someone get Commander Blake on the horn. And wake up the linguist. Looks like we might actually get to use all that training. Training. They had training for this. I was supposed to be studying primitive tool users, and instead I'd stumbled into what sounded like a military operation run by beings who'd somehow developed first contact protocols before developing faster-than-light travel. This was not in the briefing files. I decided to proceed anyway. Maybe I'd misunderstood something. Maybe Commander Blake was just what they called their tribal leader, and all this talk of units and training was just how humans organized their hunting parties. I raised my primary manipulator appendages in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent and activated my greeting protocol. The translator began broadcasting a basic mathematical sequence, prime numbers, followed by simple geometric concepts, then a harmonic pattern indicating sentience. The response was immediate. Base, the entity is transmitting. Looks like some kind of mathematical progression. Pretty sophisticated stuff. Whoever this is, they're definitely intelligent. Roger, Dr. Freeman, you getting this? A new voice joined the communication channel, slightly rougher, with what my linguistic subroutines tagged as indicators of advanced age and extensive experience. Yeah, I'm seeing it. Classic first contact protocol. They're demonstrating mathematical knowledge to establish intelligence. Very textbook. Whoever these guys are, they've done this before. They've done this before. The words sent another harmonic shiver through my structure. These humans thought I was part of some larger organization that regularly made first contact with primitive species, which meant they understood the concept of galactic civilization, space travel, and interstellar communication well enough to recognize standard protocols. But according to my files, they'd only been contacted 6 months ago. How did they already know about first contact protocols?
Doctor!
Freeman, what's your assessment? Well, Commander, they're following standard galactic consortium procedures almost exactly. Either they're part of the consortium themselves, or they've had enough contact with consortium species to learn the protocols, which is interesting. My environmental suit's emergency beacon started pulsing. Not because of any immediate danger, but because my stress levels had just spiked into the red zone. These humans knew about the galactic consortium. They knew the protocols, and they were talking about it like it was completely normal. All right, people, let's do this by the book. Dr. Freeman, your primary contact. Security teams maintain overwatch, but keep it friendly. And someone record everything. Xenobiology is going to want a full debrief. Xenobiology. They had xenobiology departments. A single human emerged from the settlement, walking with the confident stride of someone who'd done this many times before. Male, according to my scanner, middle-aged by human standards, wearing what appeared to be a uniform of some kind. He approached to within 10 meters and stopped, raising his own appendages in a mirror of my peaceful gesture. "Greetings, traveler," he said, his words coming through my translator with remarkable clarity. "I'm Dr. Alex Freeman, xenobiological specialist with Earth Defense Command. Welcome to Earth." Earth Defense Command. They had a defense command, named after their planet, which implied they had other commands. Probably an entire military structure designed around defending their world from exactly the kind of contact I was attempting to make. Greetings, I managed, my vocal synthesizer struggling with the concept. "I am Keth'var of the Galactic Scientific Consortium. I was under the impression that your species was recently contacted." Dr. Freeman smiled, and something about that expression made me deeply uncomfortable. "Oh, we were. About 6 months ago, like you said. Fascinating experience. Really opened our eyes to what's out there." He paused, still smiling that unsettling smile. "Tell me, Keth'var, how many other species has the consortium contacted in the last standard year?" The question hit me like a plasma bolt. That information is... Why do you ask?" "Just curious. See, we've been doing some math since first contact, and the numbers are interesting. The consortium has been around for, 12,000 years? Contacted maybe 4,000 species in that time? That's about one new species every 3 years on average. My crystalline structure was vibrating at frequencies that would have been audible to most species. That sounds approximately correct. Mm-hmm. So imagine our surprise when, in the 6 months since we were contacted, 17 different consortium species have visited our little corner of space. That's a contact rate increase of about, let's call it 5,000%. I tried to process this information. 17 different species? In 6 months? That was completely outside normal protocol. First contact was supposed to be a gradual process, carefully managed to prevent cultural shock. You didn't just open the floodgates and let random xenobiologists wander through like tourists at a zoo. Now, Dr. Freeman continued, his tone conversational but somehow threatening. "We asked around, talked to some of those visitors. Turns out most of them had files on us that were pretty seriously outdated. Files that suggested we were primitive, probably still living in caves, definitely not a threat to anyone." Oh no. "Dr. Freeman, I can assure you that the consortium's intentions are purely scientific." "I'm sure they are. The thing is, we humans have a saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And lately we've been feeling like maybe someone's been trying to fool us." The commander's voice crackled through the communication channel. "Dr. Freeman, we've got movement on the perimeter sensors. 3 more ships just dropped out of FTL. Freeman's smile never wavered. "Well now, that's interesting timing. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Keth'var?" I absolutely did know something about that. Those would be other consortium researchers, probably with the same outdated files, coming to study the primitive humans. This was about to become a very complicated situation. "Dr. Freeman, I think there may have been some miscommunication regarding your species' status." Miscommunication, right. He touched something on his uniform, and his voice suddenly carried to the entire settlement. "Attention all personnel, we have multiple contacts inbound. Defensive positions, but keep it friendly unless they prove otherwise." And then I watched, with growing horror, as this supposedly primitive human settlement transformed itself into a military installation in under 30 seconds. Concealed weapon emplacements rose from the ground. Camouflaged structures revealed themselves to be defensive positions. What I'd taken for simple dwellings were apparently barracks, because humans in military gear were emerging from them in perfect formation. But the real terror came when I looked up. The sky was full of ships. Human ships, sleek and deadly looking, dropping out of whatever FTL system they developed and taking defensive positions around their planet. Not just a few ships, dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. "Jesus Christ," someone muttered over the comm channel. "Look at them all." "Commander Blake to all units," came a new voice, crisp with authority. "We have confirmation of multiple consortium vessels in system. Unknown intentions, but given recent patterns, we're treating this as a potential reconnaissance in force." Reconnaissance in force. These humans thought they were being scouted for some kind of invasion. Which, to be fair, they kind of were. "Dr. Freeman," I said carefully, "I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding." "Oh, I'm sure there has," he replied. "The question is, are you part of it, or another victim of it?" Before I could answer, the air around us shimmered, and 3 more consortium researchers materialized. Standard transport protocol, nothing threatening about it, just efficient. But the humans reacted like they'd just been attacked. Weapons appeared in their hands like magic. Not primitive kinetic weapons either, but energy-based systems that looked remarkably sophisticated for a species that was supposedly hitting rocks together 6 months ago. "Easy," Dr. Freeman called out. "Standard transport beams, no immediate threat, but everyone stay sharp. My fellow researchers looked around in confusion. They'd expected a primitive settlement and maybe one native to study. Instead, they'd materialized into what was obviously a military compound, surrounded by beings who clearly understood advanced technology and viewed them as potential threats. Keth'var, one of them said. Zilthar, a fellow xenobiologist who specialized in behavioral patterns. What exactly is the situation here? The situation, I said slowly, is that our briefing files were approximately 6 months out of date and catastrophically inaccurate. Dr. Freeman stepped forward, still maintaining that unsettling smile. Gentlemen, welcome to Earth. I'm Dr. Freeman, and I'll be your guide to what we humans like to call the consequences of your own actions. Zilthar made a sound that translates roughly as confused terror.
Consequences? What consequences? We're here for scientific observation.
Right. Scientific observation. Of a primitive species that you've been studying without their knowledge or consent. Freeman's tone was still conversational, but something had changed in his posture. Tell me, how many times have consortium species done this? Just dropped in on primitive civilizations to poke around and take notes? It's standard protocol, I found myself saying. We document emerging species, catalog their development, ensure they're not a threat to galactic stability. Ensure they're not a threat, Freeman repeated. By studying them without their knowledge, by maintaining files on their capabilities and weaknesses, by sending multiple research teams to catalog their defenses and military capabilities. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, because when he put it like that, it sounded exactly like what we were doing. Commander Blake, Freeman spoke into his communicator. I think we need to have a conversation with the broader consortium leadership. Copy that, Doc. Admiral Chen is standing by on the secure channel. Admiral Chen? These humans had admirals? And secure communication channels that could apparently reach wherever Admiral Chen was stationed. Keth'var, Freeman said, turning back to us. You and your colleagues are welcome to observe our society. In fact, we insist on it. But you're going to do it as invited guests, not as... What's the phrase you used? Scientific observers. One of the other researchers, a crystalline entity from the hegemony of rational thought, made a sound like grinding glass. This is highly irregular. The consortium has protocols. The consortium, Freeman interrupted, has been treating every newly contacted species like a potential threat to be cataloged and contained. Well, congratulations. You found one. That's when the real scope of the situation hit me. The ships filling the sky weren't just local defense forces. They were too varied, too numerous, too sophisticated. These were the ships of a species that had taken the sudden influx of alien visitors and reverse-engineered everything they could get their manipulator appendages on. Dr. Freeman, I said carefully, how many ships do you have? His smile widened. That's classified, but I can tell you that 6 months ago, we had 0 FTL-capable vessels. Today we have what our military analysts describe as a sufficient deterrent force. A sufficient deterrent force. In 6 months, starting from 0. That's impossible, Zilthar stammered. Faster-than-light travel requires decades of theoretical development, centuries of material science advancement, massive industrial infrastructure. You're absolutely right, Freeman agreed cheerfully. Good thing we had 17 different examples to study. Amazing how much you can learn when your entire species is suddenly motivated by the possibility of alien invasion. The communication channel crackled to life again. Dr. Freeman, Admiral Chen has reviewed the situation. She wants to extend an invitation to our guests. An invitation? I asked, trying not to let my stress harmonics leak into my voice. That's right. You wanted to study human society? Well, we'd like to show you what we've built. All of it. Full access, complete transparency. We think you'll find it educational. Something in his tone made every survival instinct I had start screaming warnings. But we were hardly in a position to refuse. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and standing in the middle of what was apparently a military installation run by a species that had gone from stone knives to starships in half a year. That's very generous, I managed. Oh, we're a generous species, Freeman said. Sometimes to a fault. But we're also practical. And right now, it's practical for us to make sure the Galactic Consortium understands exactly what kind of neighbors they've gained. The transport beam activated around us, and suddenly we were standing in what was obviously a starship. Not a human starship. The design was clearly based on consortium technology, but it had been modified in ways that made my crystalline structure ache just looking at them. Where consortium ships were built for efficiency and long-term reliability, this vessel had been optimized for something else entirely. Every surface was armored. Every corridor had defensive positions. Every system had multiple redundancies, and what looked like improvised weaponry integrated into the basic infrastructure.
"Welcome aboard the HDSV Determination," Freeman said, gesturing around the modified interior.
She started life as a consortium science vessel. One of the first to visit us, actually.
"Wonderful technology, very sophisticated."
We learned a lot from her. Started life? One of my colleagues whispered.
"Oh yes. Completely gutted and rebuilt, of course."
Turns out consortium ships are built with a lot of interesting assumptions about their operational environment. For instance, they're not really designed to operate in hostile territory. We were led through corridors that hummed with barely contained energy. Human crew members moved with the efficient precision of a military unit, but there was something else in their movements. Something that took me a while to identify. They were enjoying themselves. These humans were having fun turning a peaceful exploration vessel into an instrument of war. They approached the challenge like it was some kind of elaborate game, and they were winning. The really interesting part, Freeman continued as we walked, was the cultural exchange. See, 17 different consortium species meant 17 different technology bases, 17 different approaches to the same basic problems. It was like having a masterclass in galactic engineering. We entered what had once been the ship's main laboratory. Now it was something between a workshop and a war room, filled with displays showing ship positions, resource allocations, and what looked like strategic planning charts. For instance, Freeman gestured to a display showing ship schematics. The hegemony builds for durability and efficiency. The Zephyrian Collective focuses on speed and maneuverability. The crystalline orthodoxy, no offense, Keth'var, prioritizes information gathering and analysis. All different approaches, all with their own strengths. The display shifted, showing a new schematic. It was clearly derived from consortium designs, but integrated in ways I'd never seen before. Now, what do you think happens when you take the best features of 17 different technological traditions and combine them with a species that's been preparing for interstellar conflict since the day they learned it was possible? I stared at the schematic, trying to process what I was seeing. It wasn't just a hybrid design, it was something entirely new. Something that took the best of consortium technology and weaponized it in ways the original designers had never considered. "This is a warship," I said, the words barely above a whisper. "This is a human ship," Freeman corrected. "We don't really distinguish between the two anymore." Admiral Chen chose that moment to make her entrance, and I immediately understood why the humans had put her in charge of their military operations. She moved with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she could personally dismantle most of the consortium fleet with nothing but harsh language and superior tactics. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that makes entire star systems pay attention. "Welcome to the Sol Defense Fleet. I understand you're here to study our culture." "Admiral," I managed, trying to maintain some semblance of diplomatic protocol. "We're xenobiologists with the Galactic Scientific Consortium. Our mission is purely observational." "Your mission," she interrupted gently, "was to assess the military capabilities and potential threat level of a newly contacted species. Standard procedure, according to the files we've recovered from previous visits." Recovered from previous visits. The implication was clear. Now, normally, we'd take exception to being studied like laboratory specimens. But as Dr. Freeman mentioned, we're a practical species. And it occurred to us that maybe, instead of being offended, we should be grateful. She gestured to the strategic displays around us. After all, without the consortium's interest in our capabilities, we never would have had the motivation to develop them this quickly. The displays shifted, showing what looked like a real-time tactical overview of the local stellar region. There were a lot of ships out there, a lot of human ships. 6 months ago, we were a single-planet species with barely functional chemical rockets. Today, we have defensive installations in 17 systems, alliance agreements with 12 independent species, and what our analysts believe to be the most advanced fleet in this galactic region. 12 independent species, alliance agreements. These humans hadn't just been building ships, they'd been building a coalition. "Admiral," Zilthar spoke up, his harmonic resonance betraying his terror. "Surely you understand that the consortium's interest was purely scientific. There was no hostile intent." "Of course not," Chen agreed. "The consortium isn't hostile. You're just thorough, very thorough. 17 different research teams, all cataloging our weaknesses, all reporting back to a central authority that maintains detailed files on thousands of species across the galaxy." She paused, letting that sink in. "Tell me, what happens to species that the consortium determines to be a potential threat?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Freeman stepped forward. "We did some research of our own, you see. Turns out the galaxy is full of former civilizations that had unfortunate encounters with more advanced species. Always different circumstances, always plausible explanations, but the pattern is consistent. Species gets contacted by the consortium. Multiple research teams visit over the following months. Detailed assessments are made of military capabilities, resource availability, strategic value. And then, if the species is determined to be a potential future threat, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The consortium doesn't conquer, Chen said quietly. That would be crude, obvious. Instead, they influence. Economic pressure, political manipulation, sometimes strategic resource shortages. Always deniable, always apparently natural, but the end result is the same. I wanted to protest, to insist that the consortium was a peaceful organization dedicated to scientific advancement and galactic stability. But the words wouldn't come. Because when you looked at the pattern they were describing, when you considered the systematic nature of our scientific observations. However, Chen continued, her tone becoming almost conversational, we've discovered something interesting about this pattern. It only works on species that don't know it's happening. The tactical display shifted again, now showing what appeared to be communication networks spanning dozens of star systems. Turns out, when you warn other species about the pattern, they tend to take precautions. And when multiple species start taking precautions together, new contacts appeared on the display. Ship signatures I didn't recognize, from species that weren't in any consortium database. You build alliances, I whispered. We build alliances, Chen confirmed, based on mutual defense, shared technology, and a common understanding that maybe, just maybe, a 12,000-year-old galactic hegemony isn't necessarily acting in everyone's best interests. Freeman activated a communication panel. Keth'var, your colleagues in the consortium are probably wondering why 17 research teams have missed their scheduled check-ins. I imagine there's some concern about our little corner of space. Actually, there was probably full-scale panic by now. 17 missing research teams would trigger every emergency protocol the consortium had. Dr. Freeman, I said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? We're proposing, Admiral Chen said, stepping forward, a new kind of relationship. One based on mutual respect, transparent communication, and the understanding that Earth and her allies are not subjects to be studied. The displays around us shifted to show something that made my crystalline structure resonate with shock. It was a star chart, but not like any I'd seen before. This one showed the location of every consortium world, every fleet position, every strategic resource. We're proposing, she continued, that the consortium recognize that the galaxy has changed. That there are now players on the board who won't be catalogued, assessed, and managed like every other species you've encountered. And if the consortium refuses? Zilthar asked, his voice barely above a harmonic whisper. Chen smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on any species, anywhere in the galaxy. Then they'll learn the same lesson that 17 research teams have learned over the past 6 months. Which is? I had to ask. Humans don't like being studied without their consent. The communication panel chimed, and a new voice filled the chamber. It was speaking in perfect consortium standard, with the crisp diction of high command. Consortium Central Authority, this is Admiral Chen of the Seoul Defense Fleet. We're transmitting coordinates for a diplomatic meeting, to be held in neutral space. We have some things to discuss. There was a long pause before the response came. Seoul Defense Fleet, this is Consortium Command. We're not aware that your species had developed faster than light communication capabilities. We've developed a lot of things, Chen replied pleasantly. That's what we'd like to discuss, along with the status of 17 research teams that seem to have extended their missions indefinitely. Another pause. Longer this time. Admiral Chen, we would be interested in opening diplomatic dialogue with your species. Excellent. We'll be bringing representatives from our various alliance partners as well. Should make for an interesting conversation. Alliance partners? Chen's smile widened. Did I not mention? Turns out, when you spread the word about systematic intelligence-gathering operations, a lot of species develop a sudden interest in mutual defense agreements. The communication ended, leaving us standing in the kind of silence that usually precedes either major breakthroughs or complete disasters. So, Freeman said, turning to us, would you still like to study human culture? I looked around at the modified starship, the strategic displays, the casual competence of a species that had gone from primitive to peer competitor in 6 months, at the alliance networks, the defensive installations, the systematic dismantling of a 12,000-year-old galactic order. I think, I said slowly, I've learned everything I need to know. Freeman laughed, actually laughed. the kind of sound that suggested he was genuinely enjoying the situation. "Oh, but you haven't seen the best part yet." He activated another display, this one showing what appeared to be construction projects scattered across dozens of systems. Massive installations, clearly based on consortium technology, but modified with that same unsettling human efficiency. See, the thing about humans is, we're really good at learning from our mistakes, and our biggest mistake was assuming that just because someone seems friendly, they don't represent a threat. The construction projects were weapons platforms. Dozens of them, positioned throughout the local stellar region with clear fields of fire covering all major shipping lanes. "We won't make that mistake again," Chen added. "With anyone." And that's when it hit me. The real terror of what we'd accomplished here. We'd contacted a species that was primitive, manageable, safely contained within their own system. What we'd created was something else entirely. We'd created a species that understood galactic politics, possessed advanced technology, commanded alliance networks, and had absolutely no trust in the existing order. A species that looked at the consortium's 12,000 years of careful management and saw it for exactly what it was. A protection racket on a galactic scale. "Admiral," I said, my vocal synthesizer struggling with concepts I'd never had to express before. "What happens now?" Chen considered the question for a moment. Now we find out whether the consortium is interested in genuine partnership with independent species, or whether they prefer the old system where they were the only ones with all the ships. She gestured to the tactical displays, where human vessels continued their patrol patterns around installations that shouldn't have existed. "Either way," she added, "it should be interesting." 3 hours later, I was back in my observation pod, filing what was probably the most unusual first contact report in consortium history. How do you explain to a galactic civilization that they've accidentally created their own worst nightmare? How do you tell beings who've spent millennia managing other species that they've just encountered one that can't be managed? The answer is very carefully. But as I transmitted my final report, I found myself oddly hopeful. Maybe the consortium would adapt, would recognize that the galaxy had changed and change with it. Maybe the alliance networks Earth was building would lead to genuine cooperation between species, instead of the careful manipulation that had defined galactic politics for so long. Or maybe we were about to witness the first interstellar war in recorded history. Either way, it was going to be educational. Keth'var, Xenobiologist Galactic Scientific Consortium Final Report. Human Cultural Assessment Classification. Everything has gone wrong. Send help. Addendum. Recommend immediate diplomatic contact with Earth leadership. Also recommend updating threat assessment protocols to account for species that can reverse engineer an entire galactic civilization in under 6 months. Also recommend hazard pay, lots of hazard pay, and report epilogue. 6 months later. The consortium did adapt eventually. Turned out that when faced with a choice between acknowledging the independence of dozens of species or fighting a war against an alliance that knew all their technological secrets, even 12,000-year-old galactic civilizations could learn new tricks. The Treaty of Seoul established what historians would later call the New Galactic Compact, a framework for interstellar relations based on consent, transparency, and mutual benefit rather than systematic management by a single hegemonic power. Dr. Freeman got promoted to head of the newly formed Department of Interspecies Relations. Admiral Chen became the first human to serve on the Galactic Security Council, and Earth became the unofficial capital of what was rapidly becoming a very different kind of galaxy. As for me, well, I got my hazard pay, and a new assignment studying the long-term effects of rapid technological development on interstellar political structures. It turns out that when humans set their minds to something, they don't just solve the problem. They solve every related problem they can think of, and then invent new problems to solve just to stay busy. The galaxy, I discovered, was about to become a much more interesting place, and humans, as it turned out, were absolutely terrifying, but in the best possible way.